Hello, students. This is your fifth lecture in the American Revolution. I know this looks a little different than the other videos. I've been having trouble recording on my computer today, and so I have a document cam that I'm using now to record myself. So it looks like it's working better. So I apologize. Sometimes it goes out of focus and I have to hit a button. Maybe I look a little crazy. It just looks a little bit different, but I'm just trying to do what I can. I'm not a great tech wizard. So this is the fifth lecture in the American Revolution. You will recall that last time we were discussing how the king in the most powerful country in the world, of the most powerful nation on earth, would feel about losing to rebels because he was beginning to lose. Remember that we talked about the surrender of John Burgoyne, British general, at Saratoga to the Americans, and basically the British had lost the northern campaign of the American Revolution. We also talked about George Washington's surprise move in crossing the Delaware on Christmas night. We talked about the British campaign at Albany, again that American victory at Saratoga, and how it led the French to ally with the Americans, providing aid to them and recognizing them as a nation. And we talked about the long winter at Valley Forge. And so today I want to focus on sort of three different pieces. First of all, what is the role of women in the American Revolution, and did the revolution further their rights? Second, what is the role of freed blacks and enslaved blacks and in the American Revolution, and did the revolution further their rights? And the third thing I want to talk about is the front of war at sea and in the southern states. All right, so let's go ahead and get to it. All right, first of all, how did women aid in the war effort? And let's consider that word or that expression, war effort, for a moment. The war effort, I believe, is a term first coined in World War I, and it just means how does an entire society mobilize and prepare for war, to include women and children, and some things we may be familiar with, like women working for the Red Cross and wrapping bandages for soldiers, or knitting socks, and collecting metal and growing victory gardens, and Boy Scouts selling war bonds, things of that nature. While a way that women helped in the American Revolution was they took over the jobs of men. So think about this. If your husband is a farmer and he goes away to war, you don't just say, oh, well, I'm going to focus on my nails. I'm not going to go out there and do any farming. So what if I don't eat? So what if my children don't eat? No, you wouldn't do something like that. You would find a way to get those crops cared for and bring in the harvest. So women took over farming. Other occupations they took over for men while they were away, being a cobbler, so that's making shoes, weaving cloth, even blacksmithing. So horses still need to be shod. It's particularly important during a war that you have horseshoes. Some women even joined their husbands on the war front, and that expression just means the action of war. That's the war front. They provide nursing care, so medical care for the men. They washed the clothing, they cooked, and this is important both for the sake of morale and also adding sanitation and making sure food is properly prepared. This is good for the men. One person that I'm sure that we've heard of, who's almost a mythological character in American lore, is Betsy Ross. We've heard, I'm sure it's about 2 parts romantic myth and 1 part the truth. She's meant to be a beautiful, young widow who's a seamstress, and Washington apparently appeals to her himself and says, we need a flag, something to represent America, something which we can all rally behind, which is a great idea. And I think it said she even designs it herself, sews that first flag. Another famous woman coming out of the American Revolution, her name is Mary Ludwig Hayes, and she has the nickname Molly Pitcher because she carried water at the front, hydrating the soldiers like a pitcher, okay? And she took her husband's place loading the cannon when her husband was fallen in the action of war. This was at the Battle of Monmouth in 1778. All right. Now, you may wonder, did the American Revolution change women's ideas towards their own freedom? And understand that that language of the Declaration of Independence was something everyone was thinking about. The Declaration, after all, was distributed, we know, in 1776, and everyone was reading it. And it said, all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we've talked in class that all men, it's loosely interpreted to mean all of us, women too, mankind, and that does refer to women. But back then, I think it really did just refer to the men. The women, of course, we have life, we have freedom, we have the right to pursue our happiness. We are endowed by Creator with these rights, by our Creator with these rights. We are as human as men, but it didn't quite apply that language to women. And women hoped it would. They caught that revolutionary spirit, and they also became confident in their abilities as they took on men's roles, and they were part of the war effort too, and they wanted to be recognized as such. And so they began to advocate for their rights, but alas, it was going to be about another 140 years before women would get those rights and understand legally what those rights mean. We talked about, when we talked about the Declaration of Independence, the consent of the governed, and how consent is expressed by a citizen is through voting. Well, women could not vote. They could not own property. They could not initiate divorce proceedings. And whatever your opinions are of divorce, when you study history and a woman can't leave an abusive husband, or her husband can bring several women into the home he's not married to and treat as wives, or all sorts of kinds of abuses, and she can't do anything legally, that isn't healthy or helpful. And women wanted those rights to be able to look after their own freedom in the same way that men could. So, because during the Revolution, we lived in a patriarchal society where there's a man at the head of it. So Abigail Adams, we know she's a very intelligent woman. Her husband John respected her as an equal. And she wrote to him during the Constitutional Convention. She said, "Let us not forget the ladies, John. Don't forget the ladies." So she hoped that he would include women in the language of the Constitution, that they would have these same rights as men, that they were worthy of as well. But most of the men in Congress did not agree with Abigail. And that's going to be, again, a battle for 140 years later. But again, I don't want you to lose hope or give up on the American project when you hear there were groups that were excluded, because that's history. Understand that the American Revolution stretched the franchise of who could be politically active, who had rights. In the past, it had been maybe just kings or aristocrats or men who owned property, and franchise means who can vote. And so it may start small, but it's stretched now to include maybe all men who own property, then it's stretched all men. And that's going to take some rioting and some revolution for that to become true. Eventually it will be stretched to include people of color, though we know that's an imperfect stretching, but ultimately women will be included as well. And that is history. This is still a step toward freedom for individuals, but it's not a step that includes women yet. All right. So you may wonder then also, what about freed blacks, enslaved blacks in the American Revolution? Well, the first thing to consider is that in 1776, there are 500,000 African Americans in the colonies. And initially, the Continental Congress refused to let them, whether they were free or slave, join the army. They doubted whether they were really loyal to the Patriot cause. And well, who could blame them if they weren't? These were people who had enslaved them, right? You may recall that when we were talking about the Sons of Liberty and patriotism kind of reaching its fevered pitch around the time of the intolerable acts, that some blacks had petitioned the British saying, hey, give us our freedom and we'll fight for you, and it was largely ignored, I told you. Well, now the British are beginning to court some male slaves to agree to get them to serve the king, to fight for them. And Washington was concerned about this. He was concerned about any African Americans serving the British, and so he thus asked Congress to allow freed African Americans to enlist in the Continental Army. And as a result, 500,000 African Americans from all the colonies but South Carolina served in the Army. 2,000 served in the Navy, and the Navy allowed African Americans to join from the start. And sometimes, you may wonder how they served, sometimes they did form special regiments that were somewhat segregated, and other times they fought alongside the white soldiers. And so there are two African American men of note that we're going to hear a bit about their life story. One's name is Wentworth Cheswell, and he is a New Hampshire schoolmaster. He's well educated, a freed black, and like Paul Revere, he rode all night to warn that the British were coming, and he helped fight at Saratoga. So let's listen to a little bit about his life. Push this button. There. Okay. So, let's see. Wentworth Cheswell. Most Americans know about Paul Revere's famous ride. Many of them know William Dawes also rode for Concord that night in hopes that at least one of the men would reach Jonas Clark's house. And we mentioned William Dawes in class. There they would warn John Hancock and Sam Adams that the British were coming to arrest them for treason. But not many people know that another rider headed out in a different direction that night. He was Wentworth Cheswell, an African-American patriot of New Hampshire. We're going to hear a bit of his history now. Wentworth Cheswell was the grandson of a slave named Richard Cheswell. Richard had gained his freedom in 1717. He became the first African-American to own property in the colony of New Hampshire. Richard married and had a son whom he named Hopestill. Hopestill grew up and became a house builder. He worked hard and had a successful business. Because he did good work, many wealthy people called him to build homes for them. He built a house for John Paul Jones, and we're going to hear about John Paul Jones when we hear about the war at sea. And another for Reverend Samuel Langdon, a Patriot pastor and the president of Harvard University. When Hopestill's son was born, he was named Wentworth after colonial governor Benning Wentworth. So Wentworth, here's a side note, was the first African American elected to public office. In 1768, Wentworth was elected town constable, the first of many offices he held throughout his life. 2 years later, in 1770, he was elected town selectman. The selectmen were considered the town fathers of the community. Other town offices in which he served included 7 years as auditor, 6 years as an assessor, 2 years as a coroner, 7 years as a town moderator, which means he presided over town meetings, and 12 years as a justice of the peace. For half a century, including every year from 1768 until 1817, Wentworth held some position in local government. So when you consider what this means, the small town government meetings with selectmen and town moderators, I have two references for you. One is fancy, one is not. One is, think of when you eventually will read Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. He saw this happening in America, these small meetings of people in small communities, and he said this is really an American thing when anyone can become part of the government, become part of the decision-making process. He thought small-town politics was distinctly and uniquely American. And we know now that, of course, national politics seems more interesting, more provocative. It takes up our attention. Maybe we don't want to do the work of knowing who our local school board is. But these are the people who make the decisions that really affect our lives, and we should exert ourselves to understand them. And my other reference to help you understand this, less highbrow, is the Gilmore Girls, okay? You may remember they have town meetings. They have a selectman, Taylor, right? And when they go into these meetings, Taylor moderates their sometimes silly arguments, and Lorelai and Rory always take popcorn and red vines. They think it's a really entertaining tradition to go and watch these meetings. But the point is, Wentworth, a black man, he was very much involved and had positions of authority in governing and establishing governing traditions in New Hampshire. So let's go on and see his role in the war effort. Because Wentworth's father was able to pay for a good education, Wentworth went to the academy at Byfeld, Massachusetts. The school was 30 miles from his home, but young Wentworth liked learning. He studied many subjects in books. He also learned to swim and to ride horses well. And we know riding a horse is very important. It's part of why George Washington was so respected. He had wonderful skills on a horse. Wentworth later became a teacher. He married Mary Davis and had 13 children. By the time he was 21 years old, he was an important man in the community. He was educated, owned property, and was a leader in his church. Wentworth was also a Patriot leader. The town elected him to the safety committee. His job was to carry important messages between leaders and towns. It was at this time that he took his midnight ride. In April of 1776, Wentworth signed an important paper along with 162 other men of Newmarket. This was the association test. By signing, Wentworth promised to fight against the British if the colonies declared independence. In 1777, he joined the American Army and the Light Horse Volunteers. Cheswell's company marched 250 miles to Saratoga, New York. There they joined General Horatio Gates. They fought hard against British General Burgoyne and won the first American victory in a major battle, again referencing that painting where Burgoyne is surrendering. Later, Wentworth was elected to help write the first state constitution of New Hampshire. That is a big deal. He also helped start the town library. He was the town's unofficial historian as well. Now, except for the fact that he doesn't invent things, he sounds a little bit like a Ben Franklin in his community, doesn't he? Helping establish libraries, writing the history of the people of New Hampshire. He recorded stories of Newmarket's early days and wrote articles about things that were happening in town at the time. Wentworth Cheswell died of typhus fever at the age of 71. He left a legacy as a patriot, a teacher, a historian, a church leader, a judge, and a father of the community. His life was one of honor and service. All right, so next we'll read about James Armistead Lafayette. I'm going to take a quick drink, beg your pardon. So the next African American of distinction isn't a freed black, but a slave named James Armistead Lafayette, and he is a spy. So James Armistead was a slave when the Revolutionary War began. He wanted to fight with the Americans against the British. He asked his owner, William Armistead, for permission to join the army. His master agreed. So James enlisted to serve under the Marquis de Lafayette, a young French general. And you'll remember that he is someone who worked closely with Washington, well-respected Frenchman. James lived in Virginia. There were 2 British generals attacking in Virginia. They were British General Cornwallis and the American traitor Benedict Arnold, and we will talk more about Benedict Arnold later. Lafayette needed to be clever in order to fight well. He needed to know as much as possible about the British plans. That way he could be prepared for anything the enemy might try to do. So one thing we know is war isn't just who fights the hardest, who has the best weaponry, whose heart is in it the most. It's a combination of a lot of different things. And some of it is who has the most information, the slyest tactics. He decided to send, and again he is Lafayette, a spy into the British army. Who would be a good man for the job? It would have to be someone who would not be suspected. He needed a man who did not appear to be a patriot. James Armistead said he would be willing to go. So think about that. He just looks like an ordinary slave. No one would suspect him of being important to the patriot cause. Lafayette thought James was perfect. He could enter the enemy camp pretending to be a runaway slave looking for work. If the British would give him a job, he could listen when the leaders talked about their plans. then he could send messages to the Americans. James traveled to the army of Benedict Arnold and found jobs to do in the camp. Somehow he won Arnold's confidence. Because James was a native of Virginia and knew the territory, Arnold gave James the job of guiding British troops as they traveled through the countryside. As Arnold grew to trust James more and more, he asked James to spy on the Americans and bring back information, and James was delighted. Again, this gives him a reason to be going back and forth, and he can pass information, and then he can give misinformation to the British. Now he could freely pass from the American camp to the British camp with passes from both armies. When he heard what Arnold planned to do next, he would simply go to the American camp and report to General Lafayette. Then he would take information about American plans back to Arnold, but of course that information was false. When Arnold returned to the north in 1781, James went to the camp of General Cornwallis and played the same trick there. He moved between British camps often. The officers paid him no attention, as they talked about their plans right in front of him. Armistead, they're underestimating him, his intellect, his value, his importance. Armistead would sneak away to a hidden place and write reports. Then he would pass the reports to other spies, and they would deliver them to the Patriots. The information that James Armistead provided was a great help to the Patriots. It was a great help to Lafayette and General Washington in winning the Battle of Yorktown. That was the last great land battle of the war. Cornwallis surrendered to General Washington. Oh, okay, so that's going to get into some of the details of the end of the war, which we don't want to get into yet. But now, so here's the deal. Armistead has been very helpful. What happens to him after the war? He's a slave. The point is he is not free. Virginia had passed a law which said that all slaves who were soldiers in the Patriot Army would be free after war. But James was not a soldier. He was a spy. So that doesn't apply to him. But James's owner, William Armistead, was a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. With his help, James petitioned the Virginia government to set him free. General Lafayette wrote a testimonial of the fine service James had given in war. In January 1787, Virginia made James Armistead a free man. Then James added Lafayette's name in honor of the general. He became James Armistead Lafayette. What a name. And the story goes on to say Lafayette saw James Armistead Lafayette many years later in a crowd and embraced him. They had good memories together and trusted one another. Armistead got married, had several children, became a successful farmer. He died on August 9th, 1830. So now we know we know the particulars about the lives of two men who fought, two African American men who were part of the Patriot cause. Let's zoom out and look more closely at choices for slaves, what happened to them in the war, and whether the American Revolution helped their cause, hurt their cause. Let's see. So, many enslaved blacks had a difficult kind of choice between them, and they had to kind of look to see who they thought might win, who could help them. If the British won, they might capture the Africans and sell them. That was a concern. But if they joined the British Army and the Patriots lost, they might get hung. So they had to consider what to do. Many slaves on the southern coast, that's near the Carolinas, they ran away with British troops near the end of the war by the thousands. African American patriots, they hoped that all men are created equal would apply to them. But again, this is 90 years and then some away. They had hoped the revolution would end slavery. It did not. Again, just like with women, they'd hoped Jefferson's words of all men created equal, endowed by their creator, applied to them, but just not yet. Again, the Declaration stretches the franchise to include more people than it ever had included before, but it's not going to quite include women yet or people of color. That's going to take time and fighting, and that is human history. So, how did the war help the abolitionist movement? It did. That's a good thing to think about. During the Revolution, several northern states moved to outlaw slavery in their individual constitutions. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Pennsylvania did so. And this is going to set the scene for the American Civil War. And it's also going to lead statesmen to want to create a balance between slave states and free states. And that affects the future of slavery and controls its spread, which is a good thing. So we've gotten through two important topics. Let's go on to the last one, which is war in the southern colonies and war at sea, because that's where the focus is going to be at the end of the American Revolution. So let's talk about initial British victories. The British Navy was so powerful it dominated during the war, blockading American ports, etc. And we've talked about why blockading, it's a siege tactic. You're along the coast and you are preventing, where is my book? Here it is. Excuse me. You're along, hold on, there we go. You're along the coast and you are it's very hard to do this, I'm sorry. You are preventing supplies and men from coming in or going out. Do I need to push the button again? No, okay. The greatest American sea victory is going to be in September 1779 in the North Sea, so all across the Atlantic Ocean, over by Great Britain. And that's going to be between Patriot Captain John Paul Jones, who was just mentioned in that story about Wentworth, and he's going to capture the British warship called the Serapis, S-E-A-R-P-I-S. And I think that means something having to do with angel, like a seraph. The South was going to be more important or decisive to winning the American Revolution than wars at sea. So let's look to the South now. In 1778, under British Commander-in-Chief Sir Henry Clinton, Britain seized Savannah in Georgia, Charleston and Camden in South Carolina. So these cities along the coast. Okay. If we see South Carolina, we see Charleston, and then we see Savannah in Georgia. So I'm sorry, guys, I'm not great at this. Click. Okay, so we see seizing those important cities. And what the British hoped, was that they could persuade the loyalists living there to join their side. But the loyalists began switching to the Patriot side after about 1780, as the British, after that surrender at Saratoga, when the Americans began to win, it's kind of roll your eyes a little bit at people who are going to join you after you start to win. I kind of roll my eyes at those people, but hey, we'll take you if you're going to fight our enemy. But also there began to be talk of the British burning farms, killing civilians, torturing prisoners. And again, some of that, there's truth to it, and some of it is going to be exaggeration to vilify your enemy, of course, because no side is completely innocent in war when it comes to some of this. Now you may wonder how the tide changes for America, and that is, oh yeah, I'll get that last little bit out of here. In January of 1781, the tide began to change for the Continental Army due to two American generals. One is Nathaniel Greene, the other is Daniel Morgan. Now, Nathaniel Greene, he was a very able military leader from Rhode Island. He commanded the Continental Army in the South. The other, Daniel Morgan, was clever with tactics, so he was good at planning and deciding stealthy ways of attack. He knew how to confuse the British. He helped win the Battle of Cowpens. And Cowpens I can show you on a small map here. This is going to be, here we go. This is going to be in South Carolina. It's going to be the top corner, kind of back here. I'm so horrible at this. I'm sorry, you guys. Here's South Carolina. It's going to be this sort of top section here. Okay, that's where the Battle of Cowpens took place. I can hold up This is the first phase. Again, those of you who are really military tacticians. Okay, I'm gonna have to push this little button here. Will they let us see it better? What I may do is just attach this for you guys. I'm trying to master a medium that doesn't want to be mastered. Okay. Maybe holding it here is better. Okay, wait. There. This is the first phase of the Battle of Cowpens. And then we have the second phase of the Battle of Cowpens. Nope, that's not it. Where'd it go? Sorry, guys. Here it is. My apologies. Trying very hard to use this new. Oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. There we go. I think I'll just send it as an attachment. Doesn't want to focus. Okay. So basically, Greene and Morgan are going to combine near Greensboro, North Carolina. The Americans will retreat, but not before Great Britain is going to sustain some great losses. The U.S. soldiers also use some guerrilla warfare tactics in the South, and we know what that is. That is basically hit and run tactics, dependent upon an in-depth knowledge of geography, terrain, sometimes going after someone's supplies, you know, a little bit dirty fighting. The U.S. soldier who embodied guerrilla tactics warfare best was Francis Marion of South Carolina, always otherwise known as the Swamp Fox. He attacked at night and disappeared into the swamps, besting the British. So that's all I wanted to tell you today. I'm talking about women, slaves, and the campaign in the South. I will have another lecture for you, and it should only be a couple more lectures and we'll be done with the American Revolution. Again, we're going through it quickly, an overview, not as detailed as it could be, just in mind of time and some time that we've lost, but material I still want to be able to cover with all of you. And again, you are being given a recording. It's different than taking notes, isn't it? Because you know you're going to get all the information that you need because you have my voice here. You can listen to it as many times as you need to. You can stop it, you can rewind. So I hope it's very helpful to you. Anyway, until I see you next time, I wish you the best and toodaloo.